Hello, and welcome to the Spring 2024 Improving Restorations webinar series, collaboration between the University of Minnesota Extension and the State of Minnesota Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. This is the first in a series of 4 webinars around the theme of climate and restorations. Today, we will have 2 speakers addressing the topic of prairie restorations and climate mitigation. I'm Wade Johnson with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, also on behalf of the Board of Water and Soil Resources, working on the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. Our program collaborates with experts. My slides are not. There we go. Our program collaborates with experts around the state to evaluate restorations, identify what's working and ongoing challenges, and sharing this information through venues such as this webinar series to help improve future restorations in Minnesota. Our collaborating partners in this webinar series is the University of Minnesota Extension. Extension offers an online ecological restoration training certificate program, a 150-hour program of 5 courses. It's offered twice a year and covers the practical skills and knowledge necessary to undertake most kinds of restoration practices in the Midwest. This is an exceptional resource and for the state of Minnesota and the upper Midwest, and I encourage you all to check it out and share with your partners. During the webinar today, as questions and comments arise during the presentations, we encourage you to post questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, not the chat feature. The chat feature, which you can use if you're having technical issues, but please use the Q&A for questions, and we'll have time at the end of both the presentations are complete to have a Q&A with the speakers. At the end of the Zoom meeting today, you will see a pop-up come up on your screen with a questionnaire, a survey that will encourage you all to take this. It provides valuable feedback to us about your interests in restoration topics for future webinars, as well as where you're seeing needs for continued educational programming. This webinar series will be recorded and available on Extension's website through the link you see there. Our upcoming series of webinars in this series are forest restorations and climate adaptation coming up on March 28th. Climate contingency planning for restorations on April 11th, and seed sourcing on April 25th. And I encourage you all to tune in for those as well. Today's presentation. Our first speaker today is Clarence Lehman. Clarence is a professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior at the University of Minnesota. He's teaches ecology and works with numerous students on prairie restorations and research. Today, he will be presenting on past research and future directions around prairie restorations and climate solutions. Our second speaker today is Ben Carlson with the Minnesota Nature Conservancy. Ben is a field steward with TNC and works primarily to implement stewardship on TNC preserves and partner lands. Ben graduated with a degree in environmental studies and biology and works on various prairie stewardship and protection projects through Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota over the past 10 years. Today, he will be talking about process and decision-making for resilient prairie restorations. Without further ado, I introduce our first speaker, Clarence Lehman. Clarence, please take it away.
Thank you. I think I should be unmuted. And now, can you see my screen?
I can't see it yet.
Hold 1 second here. Sorry. So then I think you can see my screen. And I will make that full page.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, good. And I will just make this full page. There we are. Is that okay?
Yes, that looks great, Clarence. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm Clarence Lehman, and my topic today is in the subject of prairie restoration and climate mitigation. And a sort of a subtopic, can we restore the planet while feeding the world? This cover photo, by the way, is from the second prairie I restored called Pioneer Prairie. And we planted it in many different species that belonged in the area. And one plant, one Rudbeckia, came up with this brilliant red band around it. And you know what? I never saw it again. It was only one plant, and I didn't take a cutting of it. So it's now lost. All right, well, we will move forward through a series of outlines. And when you see a sunset picture, that means we're slightly changing topics. This sunset picture is donated to us by Grace Seidel, captioned the "Among the Infinite Never Repeating Textures of Sunset." Thank you, Grace, for giving that to us. Okay, so some basics of biodiversity here and around the world. The Cedar Creek Reserve, which many of you will have known about, I think, it lies at the triple meeting point of America's three great biomes. You see, from about this point in Minnesota, or from Minnesota to the east are the deciduous forests to the Atlantic. To the north are the boreal forests all the way to the Arctic, and to the west flow the prairies, amber waves of grain flowing since the early times. Anyway, now zooming in from this Minnesota picture, here is Cedar Creek where that dot was. It's a 9 square mile area for research and preservation at the University of Minnesota. And right here, you can see a little square space. That's a 20-acre square space for the biodiversity experiment. Zooming in on that, we see that it's made up of squares with different species planted in each square. These are, and here's one where there's no species planted with carefully replicated combinations of 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, and 32 species. Then zooming in further still, we see what it looks like on the ground, where we have, over the years, hundreds of student scientists sampling and helping weed and take care of this area. Here they're on platforms, you see, so they don't crush the lupine. Then this was replicated across Europe in the BioDef project to test the conclusions to see how they apply elsewhere. So what did we learn here and around the world about restoring prairie flora? And this is now published in numerous scientific accounts. First of all, biodiversity, more species, increased carbon removal from the air. Relevant to today's topic. Biodiversity increased the stability. In a dry year, if there's more species on there, one of the species that can handle dryness can increase. And in a wet year, the opposite can happen. Biodiversity increased the amount of plant material produced. The more species there were, the actual more plant material above ground that was produced and below ground. Biodiversity increased soil fertility. Biodiversity reduced nutrient loss to the groundwater. And this was a big effect that in only a few species, or in something like a cornfield, the water goes right through to the groundwater. And in the highly diverse prairie field, it doesn't. Biodiversity reduced susceptibility to plant disease. This was something of a surprise. More species means each species gets less disease. And biodiversity reduced invasion of exotic species. This is a little easier to understand because if there's more species there are fewer places in the ecosystem structure for a new species, for an exotic species to get in. Biodiversity effects became more pronounced with increased carbon in the air. Some people said, well, this won't matter, biodiversity, because we're going to increase carbon in the air, and that will help everything. Well, of course it doesn't. And it so happens in a large experiment at Cedar Creek where carbon dioxide was increased above the plots, that carbon dioxide enhanced these effects. And also, it doesn't seem to saturate if you consider a multidimensional analysis with time and space all included. And so all of these things serve our planet well. Oh, by the way, this is another little picture of Pioneer Prairie. And the practice I followed, which is something you can keep in mind, is once I got the seeds that belonged in that area, enough of them that I could afford in quantities to get them started, I then added a pinch of everything that belongs in the area based on range maps. A pinch of everything. And that means if something is suitable there, it can take off. So that pinch of everything is something to think of. So now focusing on today's topic, climate mitigation. Here's 3 graphs showing carbon removal from the air as prairie restoration gets richer in species. This is from Yang et al. In Nature Communications not so many years ago. And these dots you see here represent different combinations of species grown under similar conditions but separated in different plots. So here you see 1, 2, 4, 8 species. And at the left, it shows carbon storage in the soil each year. The center, the amount of plant material stored below ground, and on the right, the amount of plant material produced each year. So what's pretty clear here, as the number of species increases, the amount of stored underground, the amount of roots, and the amount produced above ground increases each year. And these increases were much more than in non-restored area. Now, if you can read this, here it says, like, let's look at the storage of carbon underground. Soil carbon storage rate, megagrams of carbon per hectare per year. So that's in a good, diverse 16 species plot is like 1 megagram per year. Well, what does that mean? 1 megagram per year per hectare. Well, if you work that out, it'll turn out that if you would plant, say, 30 acres of restore 30 acres of prairie on the abandoned agricultural field, that stores enough carbon each year and every year for 100,000 miles of driving in a car at 25 miles per gallon. So it's a significant, you see. But it doesn't necessarily cover all the cars of Minnesota with the land we have available. Anyway, back to the this business about more species produce more material. Darwin, as usual, Charles Darwin is here first. He wrote, if a plot of ground be sown with 1 species of grass and a similar plot be sown with several distinct genera, a greater number of plants and a greater biomass can best be raised. So he figured this out, you see, not as many experiments as we did. But think about this. He was writing about biofuel then, you see, because this was the age of horse-drawn transportation. So what was the fuel? It was hay. So he was saying you get more biofuel in a way that if you have a diverse collection than if you don't. Well, what about biofuels today? What we did on biofuels is we ran a 1,000-acre 6-year project across Minnesota to harvest biofuel from restored prairies. And rather than burning it in place, we harvested it to see if we could do it in a way that would not harm the wildlife that had recolonized. And we could. The diverse prairie wildflowers of summer change into amber waves of grain in the fall, and then we sampled this on wildlife in the center, example of sampling for index, and then examined the properties of what we harvested. And this is how that experiment went. We had it was here, here, and here, middle, south, and north of Minnesota, and we harvested in several different ways. Some of them we harvested 3/4 of the field with this little unharvested white area rotating every year. Some of them we harvest completely, and some of them we harvested in strips. And we also had these unharvested fields as controls. This is reported in PLOS 1. So the net effect was that managing by harvesting of 3/4 of the area didn't affect the wildlife significantly in that area that had recolonized. And in fact, it helped some edge-dwelling species such as insects. Well, all right. Now that's climate mitigation. And it starts immediately with prairie restoration. But ultimately, we need more than climate mitigation. We need climate restoration. So as I explained these ideas as I explored them with hundreds of ecology students each year, one student asked this question: why are you just burning the harvest? It's filled with nutrients and herbivores herbivores. Maybe we could use them too. Why not extract nutrients first and burn the remainder as biofuel? So that leads to the newest idea about massively expanding prairie restoration that I have to tell you about. for discussion and contemplation that you can help us think about. You've heard of the pure tissue culture foods that are now becoming government approved. Eventually, strawberries, carrots, filet mignon, that can be grown from nutrients extracted from any plant material, especially restored prairies. What everyone is doing now in restoration can eventually become part of a whole earth, century-long, all society endeavor, a monumental task to restore the prairie and manage the entire planetary ecosystem while feeding the world. That is a new topic coming up that needs work, and it's a long, separate discussion, of course, but no step here appears impossible. So to close this, I'll leave you with Evel Gorham's, the late, great Evel Gorham's final message to all of us. He said, "There is reason for hope," he wrote. "It may seem unimaginable that we can learn to manage consciously the entire planetary ecosystem. We should, however, remember that throughout our relatively short history, the unimaginable repeatedly has morphed into the commonplace." So think about this, Evel's closing message of hope to the world. Well, that's all. It's time for reflection. And by the way, that is a real reflection. In a real reflection in the lake on a calm day, the sky is bluer and the trees are greener than they actually are when you look at them. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Clarence. That's very good. Having research out of Minnesota showing that increased diversity in prairie plantings increases carbon sequestration is a very good takeaway, I think, for practitioners. So our next speaker up is Ben Carlson with the Nature Conservancy. And Ben, please go ahead and start sharing your screen.
One second here. Oops, that's the wrong one, sorry.
June grass, that was pretty.
Yeah, thanks. All right, does that look good?
Yes, it does.
All right.
That's good. Thanks, Ben.
All right, so I'm going to be talking today about applied diversity in our central Minnesota prairie restorations. And I was asked to talk a little bit about things that are working, things that we've seen work, things that don't work. I've only been doing this for about 4 or 5 years, so I don't know if I can speak too much to all that, but I will talk about things that we're trying and things that we would like to try, things that we've heard other people try. So a little bit about our program. I work for the Nature Conservancy, and we partner a lot with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the DNR in central Minnesota. And I kind of am the de facto leader of what's called the Seed Collaborative for our Ordway Glacial Lakes region. If you're not familiar with the Ordway Glacial Lakes region, it's kind of an area of glacial moraine with a lot of native prairies stretching between Paynesville, Minnesota and Morris. So quite a few prairies there, quite a few public lands, quite a few TNC preserves. So we're collecting seed throughout this landscape. We're processing and mixing the seed for restorations in this landscape on our own preserves as well as our partners' lands as well. I should mention that we are doing quite a bit of seed harvesting for our efforts, but the seed harvesting isn't quite doing enough for our restoration. So we do have to supplement that with vendor purchase seed as well. And I think this is important to remember because it's not only good to support the vendors, but it's also important to show that there is a demand for diverse seed mixes from the vendors. So what do we mean by diverse prairie restorations? Generally, we are trying to get the most number of species in our restorations as possible. 20 years ago, it wasn't uncommon to see restorations with only a dozen species of forbs in them. Now the recommendations are for having at least 40 to 60 species of forbs for each soil type. But our efforts have yielded restorations with over 200 species across several different soil types. And we're also trying to get diversity across different plant taxa as well. So over the last 4 years, our seed collection efforts have averaged quite a few different species of graminoids and forbs. So you can see here 31 grass species and 31 sedge species average per year that we collect. Of course, the sedges are a little bit harder to find, so only about 2% of our total seed volume that we collect comes from sedges, but we're still trying to get as many species as possible there. Sort of like Clarence was saying, a pinch of everything. And the forbs, similar story. Asters and legumes are kind of the two big forb families. So we obviously have a lot of different aster species, a lot of different legume species, but besides those two families, we have 87 other species of forbs that we're regularly collecting, and that represents about 1/4 of the total seed volume. Now we're also trying to collect seed from a lot of different soil types and soil moisture regimes. So most of the species we're collecting are coming from mesic and dry mesic prairies. But we're also collecting a lot of species from dry hilltops, as well as wet prairies, wet meadows, sedge meadows, and even some woodland and savanna plants. And another important thing about our program is that we are collecting seed from throughout the growing season. So we're out there from May until November, and 24 of the species that we collect on average are ripe before August. So we're really focusing on those early season blooming species to try and help pollinators in the early part of the season. And that represents about 1/10 of the seed that we'd collect every year. I'm not going to talk too much about diversity and genetic sources because there's going to be a future webinar on seed sourcing. But I do want to mention that we are going throughout this landscape, collecting seed from upwards of 50 sites across 7 counties. And we're focusing on sites not only within the landscape, but also 1 to 2 counties south and west of our focal landscape. And the thought is that seed from south and west of our landscape might be a little bit better adapted to a future warmer climate. We strive for 3 different seed sources, genetic sources for each species. Obviously, not every species we're going to be able to achieve that, but that's our goal. And then for vendor seed mixes as well. We're looking at seed from within Minnesota, Eastern Dakotas, the northern tier of counties in Iowa. We try and avoid seed from further south and west, just because those phenotypes are probably not as well adapted to this northern climate, but we also don't want seed from further north or east that might not be adaptable to a future climate as well. So here's a map of our landscape, the Ordway Glacial Lakes landscape in the red outline. You can see that most of the TNC preserves in pink and partner sites that we're collecting from are within that landscape, but we do have a few sites to the west and southwest that we're collecting from as well. So now I'm going to go through kind of a year in the life of a recent prairie restoration we did at our Sheepberry Fen Preserve in Pope County. This restoration was funded by a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and this grant was specifically aimed at increasing habitat for monarch butterflies. So a little bit about this restoration site. A lot of it was former farm fields. Some of it was really degraded native prairie, but almost all of it was dominated by smooth brome. And I'm not going to go too much into site prep tactics, but know that we sprayed and dissed about 40 acres of this restoration, and then the remainder we either sprayed or just direct seeded into the remnant prairie. So several different methods of site prep here. And here's a picture of the site. You can see that it's kind of rolling dry ridges interspersed with little potholes. So mostly dry mesic with a few opportunities for wetland, wet prairie on the edges of the potholes. So when we start planning our restorations, we have to think about seed harvesting because this is really what has allowed us to increase our diversity in our restorations the most. So we use both hand harvesting and mechanical harvesting methods to collect seed from all of these sites across the landscape. And I'm just going to go through real quickly some of the pros and cons of each method. So hand harvesting, this involves picking seed, bagging seed. You're going to get a lot lower seed volume because you're out there individually picking each plant. Whereas the mechanical harvesting, you're getting large volumes because you're using combines and seed strippers to collect larger amounts of seed. Of course, larger volumes of seed also means more chaff and more processing, more cleaning and drying is going to be necessary. So that has kind of become our limiting factor in how much seed we can harvest mechanically, is how much seed we're able to handle at the end of the season. But the hand harvesting, because we're able to target individual populations and we're able to go out throughout the season, May to November, and collect seed all summer long, we're able to get a much greater diversity. And we've also seen that the hand harvested seed is usually more viable. And I think this is because we're able to really keep an eye on the ripeness of seed a little bit closer. Whereas the mechanical harvesting, I like to think of it as taking a snapshot of the prairie in time. And you might be combining that prairie when all of the Liatris is ripe, but most of the goldenrod and Symphyiotrichums are not quite ripe yet. And so they might be a little bit less viable. Another downside of the mechanical harvesting is, depending on when you harvest it, you might get a lot higher concentrations of big bluestem and Indian grass in your mixture. And we found that having those two species at too great a rate can outcompete a lot of your other grass and forb species. So we try and keep those two really aggressive warm season bunch grasses to a minimum. So sometimes the mechanically harvested seed, we have to seed at a lower rate to keep those two species at a lower amount. I guess another aspect of mechanical harvesting is equipment maintenance. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but going back to hand harvesting, you can see by these numbers here, 224 species over the last few years, averaging 125 genera and 38 families that we're collecting. So the hand harvesting is really what's driving our diversity up. And I should mention that at least 53 of these species we're collecting more than a pound of, 143 species more than an ounce, and everything else of those 224 species would be kind of considered just a pinch. But we're trying to get them in our restorations at any amount possible. And then down here, last year, you can see that we only collected about 20 to 40 species through mechanically harvesting, but the amount was quite a bit more than the hand harvesting. So really the trade-offs are amount of seed or diversity of seed, but really using both methods has produced pretty decent seed mixes for our restorations. I mentioned that hand harvesting takes a lot more effort. One of the things that we have to do is track phenology throughout the season because there's hundreds of species we're tracking. We're looking at each population weekly to see how ripe it is. So I just have this spreadsheet throughout the year. I keep track every week what's flowering, what's fruiting, what's ripe, what's already senesced. So that way we can kind of plan out our seed collection activities for the next week. We also track things spatially. We track populations using ArcGIS maps. So this is our map that we have showing sheepberry fen, and each dot here represents a individual plant population, and we keep track of attributes as far as the size and phenology of that as well. So then seed harvesting happens throughout the summer. We have a crew of 2 to 4 SCA interns working for us for 23 weeks each summer. They're spending 3 to 4 days a week out picking seed across the landscape. A lot of the seeds we have to, or a lot of the plants that are blooming early in the season, we have to flag ahead of time so we can find them when they ripen and the grass gets taller. And some of the species disperse their seeds really quickly, so we try and bag these so we can catch some of the seeds. Here's our combine that we use. It's an old Gleaner combine. This has really been nice. I've been able to harvest in places where it really wasn't designed to go. And I should mention that combines were designed to harvest seed of one size, not seed of multiple sizes. So it does break down quite a bit. I spend almost as much time fixing as I do using it. And the seed mix has a lot of inert plant material, ground up leaves and stems in it, because we don't want to blow that stuff out the back end along with the aster and goldenrod seeds that we're trying to save. So we end up having to clean this seed. We take it to the Big Stone National Wildlife Refuge and send it through their fanning mill to sift out a lot of that inert plant material. We still end up with a product that's only about 25–30% pure live seed on average. But that's still a pretty diverse seed mix, so we're happy with that. We also use pull behind seed strippers. These are nice because they can go places where the combine doesn't go. The seed mix is usually about the same, usually a little bit more thatch, so it's a little harder to clean this. I'm not going to talk too much about seed processing, but I do want to touch on seed mixing really quickly because we take a lot of effort to mix our seed based on the soil type that it should be in. And you could spread the seed over the entire restoration. And what I've seen in some of these restorations that we've spread the same mix over the entire restoration is that the plant communities do tend to self-assemble on the soil type where they belong. But if you're doing that consistently, you're probably going to be wasting a lot of seed. For instance, if you're spreading a lot of prairie cordgrass and great lobelia, species that are more for wet prairies over the entire restoration, you're just wasting seed because they're not going to grow on dry hilltops. So we really take care to try and seed these mixes in places where they're going to do the best. So here we are mixing seed at Sheepberry Fen. We had 10 different mixes for this restoration, so it was a lot of effort to mix all those mixes together when we got around to spreading it. And I should mention, well, next I'm going to talk a little bit about how we calculated the seeding rates, because that's important as well. So each of these mixes, we take a sample and send that to South Dakota State University Seed Testing Lab. And this gives us an estimate of how many seeds per pound for each species are in that mix. And it gives us a purity, and also the top species, we do a TZ viability test just to see if those seeds are pretty viable. Then we use those numbers to calculate seed rates, and we look for recommendations for seeding rates from a lot of different places. This table shows seeding rates recommended by the University of Northern Iowa Tallgrass Prairie Center. These recommendations are probably a few years old, but they're still pretty relevant for us. And these are just recommendations, so take them with a grain of salt. I would say cool season grasses, I like to see those a little bit higher than 1.25 seeds per square foot, definitely more than one species. And so these are organized by soil type. So the Sheepberry Fen restoration is more of a dry mesic. So we were shooting for 45 seeds per square foot, trying to get at least 17 seeds per square foot for our forbs, and then 5 seeds per square foot for legumes. And I mentioned that big bluestem and Indian grass can be really aggressive. So we try and keep those two species combined at less than 3 seeds per square foot. So if you take the warm season grasses, 21.5 minus the 3 seeds per square foot for big bluestem and Indian grass, that leaves about 18 seeds per square foot for all the other warm season grasses like side oats, grama, little bluestem, prairie dropseed, and whatnot. I will caution that having a seeding rate that's too low could lead to invasion by exotic cool season grasses. We've seen that in a few of our restorations, and so we want to make sure that if our seeding rate is too low, we might need to add more seed or seed multiple years in a row. Another downside of having greater diversity in your restoration is that the seeds per square foot for each species might be less. So basically, more species means less density per species if you're limited in budget or harvest capabilities. So there's several ways you can get around that maybe. So I take our seed test numbers and I plug them into a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is modified from one that the Morris Wetland Management District created for calculating seed costs, but I used it to plug in the seeds per pound and my desired pounds per acre to estimate the seeds per square foot. So you can see here, this is the Sheepberry Fen mix that I created with the 10 different mixes. So big bluestem and Indian grass combined was just at 3. That's right where we want it. Legumes was at 9. If you recall from here, the recommendation was 4. So we're about twice the rate for legumes. That was just because we had so much lead plant this year. Non-legume forbs, we were at 20, so that's just above that 17, 18 recommended rate. So we did pretty good there. Going down to the bottom of the page here, you can see our total seeds per square foot was 35. So that's a little bit lower than the 45 recommended, meaning we'll probably have to follow up with a treatment of more seed next year. So then the seed spreading, we use mostly broadcast spreading. And here you can see that's actually a contractor we hired to seed at Sheepberry Fen. Some people will drill seed. I've heard that that usually favors grasses more than the forbs, whereas broadcast spreading favors the forbs. And either way, you want to make sure that your seeds are getting seeded soil contact. So if we're seeding in the spring after the snow melts, we'll oftentimes roll or pack our restorations to ensure that seed to soil contact. We like to seed in the winter on snow, because then if we get more snow, that will press it down into the soil a little bit more. It also allows more time for seed stratification to occur. So just going to close off with some other restoration methods to try and that we've used or are considering for increasing diversity. So one of the main ones is doing multiple seedings per season. So I mentioned earlier that we're collecting 24 species before August that we're considering the early season forbs. And we actually seed these in August on restorations that we did the previous year. And our thought here is that seeds that ripen in the summer are probably most viable soon after ripening. The longer we wait, the less viable they'll be, or they might need longer stratification times. So these species in this table are things that we seed every August, and I've seen a lot of these show up in our restorations, so I'm really thinking that is working. I also mentioned seeding multiple years in a row if your seeds per square foot are lacking. I've also seen evidence that certain conditions in every given year might favor certain species to recruit or germinate. So if you really want to increase diversity, continuing to interseed restorations for several years in a row might be the best way to increase species richness. Adding a pinch here, a pinch there. Of course, it's hard to know what's going to be favored from year to year, so you're probably going to end up using a lot more seed this way. I mentioned that if you are limited in the amount of seed you're able to spread, you might want to consider sowing in patches or strips to get those seeds closer together. That might allow things to germinate a little bit better because they're competing against fewer species. And it might also allow for better pollination in the future as well. And then a final method that I recommend is growing plugs from seed and planting those. And so this list is species that we have continually had challenges getting into our restorations. So we're trying to grow these into plugs to grow as well. So we hired several contractors to do this. And as you can see, it costs about $2 per plant to grow them from seed that we provide. So for seed that we would have to buy and then grow, it cost even more. So the cost here is definitely greater. And if it's a drought year, we might have to consider watering these plants for all summer. So it's might require quite a bit more maintenance. So there's downsides to plug growing as well. So some of the takeaways, probably not feasible to rely solely on seed harvest, but you probably can't rely only on vendor seed as well. As we've seen, hand harvesting is definitely the way to get more diversity. But higher diversity restorations definitely require more time and money in both harvesting and seed purchase costs. And then, having higher species counts definitely means that the seed is going to be spread thinner if you're limited on the amount of seed. That's where that strip seeding might be a better option. And then having more seed mixes is going to require more effort in mixing and spreading the seed, but you're less likely to waste the seed that way. And finally, we don't really know what's going to be successful in any given year, so I would definitely recommend planning ahead to sow seed multiple years in a row. It seems to be more and more that is the best recommendation. I think that's all I got. So Wade, back to you.
All right, actually, it's
Thank
back to
you.
Julia.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Ben.
Okay.
And Julia Bonin with Extension will take it away for the Q&A. Thank you, Julia.
And Clarence, you can light up your camera as well. So we'll have questions for the both of you at this time. And please, everyone, continue to contribute questions into the Q&A area down there. And Dan will be forwarding those to me so we can keep track of everything. So I'm going to start with a question for Clarence. So one question that we had is, do these biodiversity effects hold true for other ecosystems other than prairie? Do you have a sense of that from the literature or from your experience?
Well, when this was done through Europe, it was in a different place, similar kind of conditions. But based on the theory of it, the ecological theory, it should hold for many different conditions. See, we did these things experimentally, but also David Tillman and I spent a bit of time understanding the mathematical dynamics of it. And there, species diversity increases stability, increases productivity, et cetera, from the ecological calculations. So we think it'll apply to many different things that can be restored to high diversity places.
Thank you. And that kind of leads to a question from Ben. So did this research at all play a role in the decision making to kind of increase diversity for the sites that you're using? And do you feel like having those more species facilitates establishment of those restorations that you're implementing?
Yeah, so our choice to go with higher diversity restorations is multifold. Obviously, we want to, I think the overarching goal of our restorations is to create a prairie ecosystem that is resilient in the face of climate change and fragmentation in the landscape. And so increasing the number of species seems to be the best way to combat a changing climate and also to promote the most pollinators possible and just keep all those parts of the ecosystem functioning as much as possible.
And what kind of criteria do you use to determine where you're going to install the seed that you collect?
Yeah, so we start with sites that are adjacent or surrounded by our native prairies. So most of our TNC preserves in this landscape have more native prairie than restored prairie on them. And so really making a buffer around those native prairies or infilling go-back fields or brome fields that are in those prairies is usually the top priority. And then secondary priority is just connecting blocks of native prairie together to create corridors so that species can move between larger blocks of native and restored grassland.
Kind of a follow-up to that was someone had asked what the herbicide product was and timing and rate of application. So if you're doing some site prep on, for example, those brome fields, how important is that process and the tools and process of that?
Yeah, I think you could do a whole webinar on site prep alone. We used just a standard glyphosate, 2 quarts per acre, 2 applications in summer and late summer, early fall. And then we dissed part of it in late fall. Getting rid of the brome is definitely going to make for a quicker start to your restoration. But I've also seen evidence from other restoration practitioners that just burning the brome, seeding directly into that thatch, and then continually burning it over and over again. If you put enough seed down, you could just outcompete the brome eventually without spraying it. So I'm not saying spraying is necessary. And I should mention also that there were about 19 acres of that restoration that we did not spray because there were already quite a few native species there that we did not want to get rid of. They were at rates that, or coverage that was not ideal, so we basically interseeded those areas with more seed to try and increase the diversity, but we didn't want to spray them either.
Great, thank you. Clarence, what was the basis for the choice of the species that were included in the study at Cedar Creek? Do the plots with, and then follow up to that, do the plots with more species include the same species that were included in, so like if you had 4 species in a plot, were those also in the 34 species plots?
So typically, well, they were randomly selected. So we took a group of species that were, first of all, known to be native to the area. And we got seed for them. And then this was way back when I was starting in this stuff. So then I made a computer program that would randomly assign species to replicate plots. So we had many different copies of the 4 species plots, and they were different sets of 4 species, you see.
Okay.
And So they were native to the Cedar Creek area, which is central Minnesota area. They included all the familiar things like big bluestem and little bluestem and rudbeckia and all this stuff, you see. But only, now the 32 species plots were not part of the main study, but the up to 16 were. And so they were, yeah, randomly assigned by computer and then checked to make sure that they were, appropriately replicated and so on.
Here's a kind of a follow-up question here that both of you can take a stab at. So in thinking about a remnant prairie, would you recommend, or is it advantageous to add additional native species if you already have a remnant to try to improve that effective biodiversity? And I'll let Clarence go first on that, maybe.
Well, I would say yes, add seeds. I mean, they can take off. They go best in a greenhouse, of course, in a watered thing, but they grow fine in bare, and they can also be done in prairie. So continue to do that, to enhance them. I've been doing that with prairie seeds for a long time. I seed them over the previous prairie. And and by the way, this is related to a topic that we haven't discussed too much. I know Ben mentioned it, but you don't want to take seeds from north of here because the climate isn't going to be getting cooler for a while. If you want to take seeds, you take them from the right place or even south of here, and then you're adapting to the future. And by the way, how fast is climate moving north? You can make this calculation from the maps that show changes in range. Climate is moving north in Minnesota at 1 foot per hour. So during this presentation, climate will have moved north 1 foot. That works out to over the course of Minnesota over the century. But it's really quite surprising how fast climate is moving now.
Ben, do you want to take a stab at that? Enhancing the remnant?
So when we're talking about remnants, I think there's quite a bit of debate around this because from a botanical standpoint, I think people view remnants as kind of a museum in a way. Looking at a remnant, the species that are there kind of tells you what naturally grows there. And so I've heard some botanists say you can add stuff to a remnant, but don't add stuff that wouldn't normally be found there. And that also has practical implications too, because you don't want to add something that might be invasive or too aggressive and outcompete some of the native species that are there. So if you're adding stuff to remnants, we've done it in places where the remnants are really degraded by grazing. And we did some of that at Sheepberry Fen as well. But we did it very carefully, only in places where the plant community was already very degraded. I don't think I would ever add anything to a really robust remnant plant community. However, there is maybe benefit to doing some assisted migration in and around native plant communities to try and get some of those genetic sources closer together so that they can cross-pollinate and adapt. Yeah, I guess I don't have any actual recommendations for doing this, but just do it very carefully and know that there's going to be people who disagree with you.
Right.
Yeah,
So
to add, when I was saying restoring remnants, these were some pretty degraded remnants. There were places where you can find some Indian grass and bluestem, so you know something was there. And so now one thing, by the way, that happened in the prairies I restored, which was pretty interesting and surprising to me, is I restored right up to the edge of the road, and I actually got permission to do that. And then what happened is the mowers pick up those seeds and they spread them. And now sort of miles around, there are prairie seeds along the road. And this will spread over the course of time, you see. Those were not remnants. Those were, they were planted roadsides, which they weren't in the old days doing that with native plants.
I will also add that, thinking about seed dispersal, the seed dispersal vectors that were here 150 years ago, namely bison or other animals, aren't around anymore. So, moving stuff from one county to the next is not really that far-fetched, considering that would have been done by bison many years ago as well.
So the mowers, the road mowers, are the new bison.
Right. So I have a question kind of related to the seed movement. So Ben, you had kind of talked about how you are, if you're harvesting seed that's not on site, you're going to sites that have a similar, soil type, climate, et cetera. So there historically had been, like, let's say a 200-mile rule or a 150-mile rule where you could collect seed, and you kind of envision that as a round buffer around your site. But do you kind of envision your site as being more elongated or oddly shaped, or how do you kind of conceive that? And then how does that also work when you're purchasing seed from a vendor and how they source seed?
Yeah, so I think I had that slide showing the landscape. Our landscape itself is kind of elongated. So we consider that anything in that landscape would have been fairly homogeneous historically. And so our 100-mile buffer, or what you want to call it, is definitely skewed to the south and west because we want to find genetic sources that are a little bit more adapted to a slightly warmer climate. And the second part of your question, for vendor seed mixes, yes, kind of similar thing. And there we're limited on where vendors are, or what's available from vendors. So usually the vendors will say the county of origin. And so we generally kind of look to anything within southwestern Minnesota, that northern tier of counties in Iowa, eastern South Dakota, southeastern North Dakota.
Is it more important how just geographically where the seed was harvested from, or also do you consider, like if the seed was harvested off of a dry hilltop prairie, it could be the same species, but do you care if it came out of a more mesic site or a more dry site?
For a given species, I don't care as much about that. And there are some species that there are different varieties and different phenotypes that do grow in different soil types. Prairie blue-eyed grass is a great example. I see it growing a lot in almost wet prairie situations quite a bit, but also on dry hilltops. I do tend to mix all that together and consider it all one species. I'm not sure, I might change my mind on doing that in the future, but it's a lot more complicated to keep things separated that much.
I had one question about folks finding a decrease in legume species, and it may be related to scarification, but I'm thinking, let's think about it more broadly. Are there some species that are just not, like maybe from different functional groups that are not establishing as well, or we're finding lapses in their establishment? And Ben, why don't you take that first?
Yeah, well, I had that list of species that we are growing plugs from. A lot of the early season forbs, I think people are struggling with in their restorations, and that might be because of the timing of seeding, and that's why we switched to the summer seeding. And that's definitely worked for some species, but not all of them. So like hoary puccoon is one that we've struggled to get into our restorations. And I think that has to do more with the dispersal mechanism. I think it's, from what I've observed, a species that is planted by ants. And so it's something that might be a little bit more difficult to get into restorations. I think for legumes, scarification probably has a lot to do with it. Viability might also have a lot to do with it. I see a lot of people harvesting legume species way too early. It might look like they're ripe, but you really have to open up that seed pod and look at that seed, see if it's really hard, see if it's ripened completely before harvesting it. So that might be one reason why the viability there is going down.
Do you have a sense, and I'll throw this to both of you, do you have a sense of degradation of mycorrhizal relationships due to climate change or just from land use and development? And Clarence, do you want to give some thoughts of that relative to the Cedar Creek area?
Degradation of mycorrhizal.
So legumes and my understanding is that the puccoons also have mycorrhizal relationships.
Yeah,
in particular.
all this very complex things with the soil dynamics. Yes, so let's see. When I did my prairies, but by the way, my prairies, Ben has so much more experience with a wide variety of prairies, and I have some experience with things at Cedar Creek and with the theory of it. But when I did mine, we added material to help we added mycorrhiza into the soil in little packets. And whether that helped or not, I don't know, because we didn't do any experiments on that on my place. But of course, the microecology of the soil changes enormously with different plants there. If you get invasive species in, it changes that. I'm told it changes that community quite considerably. This goes all the way from microbes to all the way up to the predators that live in it. The soil is a very complex ecosystem, not generally appreciated because we just walk on it.
Mhm.
As far as, let's see, there was another question earlier about what things work and what don't work. When I was just doing my own, by the way, when I was doing my own prairies, there were some experiments I did, but it was mainly to restore the system. It was mainly for making things better the way they used to be. But I did go out and hand gather seeds, liatris seeds from railroad sides, and I gathered 25 million seeds in many grocery bags, and I planted them, and 12 came up. I don't mean 12 million came up. I mean 12 came up. And then that did expand with time. And who knows what that was? Is that a soil problem or what? Anyway.
And Ben, any thoughts on that? Mycorrhizal relationships? I assume you put some rhizobiums in there as well in your seed bank?
We don't really. We've
Okay.
contemplated doing that. That's one of those things that we ponder and we think about in the back of our head, but we just haven't really found a viable way to do that at scale yet.
I have a lot of questions yet, and it looks like we're not going to get to them all. But can we talk a little bit about monitoring, Ben? How do you go about monitoring your sites to determine whether or not, all of your species are showing up, or, that you needed to do those extra steps of additional seedings, et cetera?
Yeah, we do have a protocol for doing transects on our restorations just to measure a baseline of species diversity, the presence of exotics like Kentucky bluegrass and brome grass. And if we're out there and we see a lot of spacing between plants, that's after several years we might decide to add more seed. If we're seeing a lot of Kentucky bluegrass invading, we'll add more seed. Yeah, we just do simple monitoring transects to look at what's growing.
So you're looking at A, the desirable species that are arriving, and then B, so you're kind of scouting for your invasive species at the same time?
Yep.
You'd say?
At Cedar Creek, by the way, those interns that the student scientists come, they pull up plants that don't belong in that plot. See, so then that's not what we usually do in prairies. We don't go around doing that. When I planted my second prairie, I thought I should run some personal experiments for myself. So I did do a carefully designed experiment on the various treatments. So the pre-treatments are spray first to get rid of all the vegetation, then till, and then seed, and then mow or burn afterwards, multiple each year afterwards. So of course the most important one was seeding, right? But the one that really mattered was spraying ahead of time in my experiment. And the burning in subsequent years didn't much matter. So when I did my third prairie, I simply sprayed it, and then I didn't till it at all. I just smoothed it off with a bulldozer grade on the back of the tractor, and that came out to be a beautiful prairie, one of my favorite places in the world, that little prairie, the third prairie.
I want to thank you both. I'm going to cut us off now because it is 1 o'clock, and so we'll respect everybody's time. But I want to thank you both, and I'm not sure if Wade is going to come on as another thank you, but we really appreciate your time today. And we did have a lot of unanswered questions, but I hope that students now, or not our students, but our audience may be aware that we have a couple of great resources here that they could reach out to potentially if they have some follow-up questions.
Thank you all. Thank you, Julia.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Clarence.